Thank you, Andre. I have such fond memories of prior engagements with the Chicago branch. I'm delighted to be here again. Many of you know me only through my work with the nonprofit Mystech. What I am now going to present is, for me, equally as important. So put aside your Christmas concerns, get out your detective's badge, because over the next hour and 20 minutes, we're going to solve a mystery as told by Leonardo da Vinci through his paintings as well as through the paintings by his students. And thank you for joining, because well, if not, don't worry. Sit back and be intrigued tonight. Like most Christmas stories, we will begin with the scene from the Gospel of Matthew known as the Adoration of the Magi, a theme commonly depicted by Renaissance painters. It was a scene also begun by Leonardo, but oddly abandoned. We will learn why. Many historians have written about this artist and scientist, who is well known as the Renaissance man. Here is a quote from Rudolf Steiner, who had many things to say about Leonardo. Quote, "We can say that he bore within him the whole spirit of his age, and yet he was often misunderstood or out of sync with his time, precisely because he was already working out of the depths of the spirit, making use of powers that were only to emerge in later centuries." University of Virginia professor Francesca Fiorani's paper in 2015 researched this topic. She concluded that all evidence suggested that Leonardo, who was already an accomplished artist at 20 years old and now almost 30, was eager to paint this adoration. His patron was the monastery of San Donato a Scopeto. It was intended for the main altar of their church. Like all other Florentine artists, Leonardo knew the scene well, as there was an elaborate Three Kings festival in Florence every Christmas, complete with a costume parade that reenacted the adoration of the Magi. During Leonardo's years in Florence, the three Medici brothers were often used as the Three Kings. To understand Leonardo's artistic goal, we turn to Leonardo's treatise on painting. And I quote, "The ability of the painter is useless if he cannot make viewers identify with his painted figures," end quote. Art historian Francesca Fiorani concluded that he wished that the faithful who pray in front of this religious work would identify with the feelings of the painted figures so deeply that they would experience the divine as forcefully and as vividly as the characters who were being depicted. Now, this was a large panel, more than 8 feet by 8 feet. With this size, it is striking that Leonardo constructed the architecture in perspective directly on the panel. The foreground crowd consists of about 30 figures. Leonardo was showing his talent to take this familiar scene and to reanimate it. Leonardo wished to show how this birth was for all humanity through a depiction of a panoply of emotions. Here we see terror, fear, grief, weeping, as well as pleasure, joy, and laughter, and so on. The older man near the child needs to shield his eyes from the brightness of the Virgin. Everywhere we see conversation, and look at all the gesticulating hands. We shall see how Leonardo used hands as an indicator of action. In each of the paintings we will view, I want for you to make note of the various hand gestures. Art historian Francesca Fiorani concluded that, quote, "This painting was a tour de force. Leonardo invented so many figures and animals, mingling them with buildings, vegetation, and rocks at different levels, and adjusted limbs and facial expressions," end quote. To show Christ came for all of humanity, he planned to integrate a total of 66 people and 11 animals into one coherent painting. Some art historians suggest this challenge was too much for him. Some believe that he could not depict both the spiritual and the physical light in a way consistent with his studies in religion and science. Some suggest he became bored and walked away. Some surmise there may have been some personality difficulties with his patron. I don't buy any of these. In this talk, you will hear of another theory with convincing proof for why Leonardo abandoned this painting in 1481. Let's first look at some adoration paintings that Leonardo likely experienced. This adoration was done by Fra Angelico with his student Filippo Lippi. The scene shows a large entourage. The kings have come to the family's house in Bethlehem. Giotto's adoration shows the star that guided them. It shows an awake and present Joseph. And in a moment, we'll see a Joseph sleeping in Giotto's shepherd's painting. Note their house. It is but a shelter in front of a rock. There may even be a cave behind the people. Here is another example, this one by Perugino, who was enrolled with Leonardo when they were both students in Andrea del Verrocchio's studio. And then he later became Raphael's teacher. Note the house that the family lived in that frames them. Note too the three halos. Here is a pre-Renaissance example. This painting is from 1298 by Pietro Cavallini. Again, note that the house is not intended to be in perspective, but included to indicate location. Dirk Bouts is an example of the Northern Renaissance painters. He was born in Haarlem in Northern Netherlands. Note how he has depicted the family's home. So why did Leonardo abandon this masterpiece in the making? To answer this, let's first take a look at his life leading up to this decision. Born on the 15th of April, 1452, Leonardo was an illegitimate child. The world is thankful that he was illegitimate, for otherwise, Leonardo would have become like his father, a notary. His father helped with his early education. At the age of 8, he was enrolled in vocational training in nearby Florence. At 12, his father had placed him in the best artistic workshop in the region, namely that of Andrea del Verrocchio. Other students with him were Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Lorenzo di Credi, and Perugino. The next generation of students included Michelangelo and Raphael. Here we see a sculpture done by Verrocchio where Leonardo was the model for David. At the young age of 20, Leonardo was admitted to the prestigious Artists Guild of St. Luke. At 24, he and a small group of young men were arrested. It is not clear if they were arrested for public nudity or possibly for sodomy, because at least one member of the group was also a member of the Medici household. The charges were quietly dropped. You see, the Medici were essentially the rulers of Florence. 4 years later, Leonardo was admitted as a member of the Medici household, as well as a member of the Garden of San Marcos, where the great philosophers and scientists of the time gathered to use its library and to hold conversations while strolling in its gardens. With these memberships, it would be surprising if Leonardo was not also a member of Florence's Accademia Platonica, and more about that academy in a moment. Overshadowing the burgeoning Renaissance was the political and religious situation in Florence, as well as in much of Europe of the 15th century. Besides the Medici family, perhaps the most important political figure was their rival Girolamo Savonarola, Born in 1452, the same year as Leonardo, he was a Dominican friar. These friars were, at that time, the inquisitors. Earlier, they had been part of the scholastics. Thomas Aquinas, for example, was a Dominican. Savonarola fought corruption both in the church and in politics, but his heart was set on a theocracy. As justification for his role, he claimed visionary access to the Virgin Mary, who, he said, blessed his work and authorized him to clean up Florence, to make it into the New Jerusalem. As part of this cleanup, his mob sought out and burned so-called vain art. Leonardo knew of him before he arrived in Florence. For Savonarola had been assigned in 1478 to teach at a priory in Ferrara, a sister city to Florence. Their Este family was similar to what the Medici family was to Florence. Early in 1482, Savonarola was assigned to be the lector at San Marco in Florence. We must pose the question, did his reputation factor in Leonardo's decision to leave Florence for the relative safety of Milan in 1482? 12 years later, in 1494, the First Italian War broke out. Savonarola's supporters used the opportunity to oust the Medici family from Florence. But Savonarola would soon fall from favor with the Pope. He would be excommunicated and then tortured to confess that his visions of the Virgin were invented. After this, he was burned with two of his followers in 1498. Much more could be said. For example, St. Francis and his reform attempts, and the power of the Italian families or the French monarchs to get their guy installed as the Pope. I offer all of this to give you a taste of the near theocracy of the times. Keep in mind, all through this 15th century, the Inquisition was very active. The Renaissance would become an age of scientific advancement only through much suffering and repression. Note, Ghirlandaio Bruno was condemned to burn in 1600 due to his scientific writings. Let's briefly explore the sources for the great awakening of the Renaissance. Many had roles here. One I wish to mention was Manuel Chrysoloras, who lived from 1355 to 1415. He was sent in 1391 to Italy to be an envoy from Constantinople. He gave lectures in several cities about the Greek philosophers. After 5 years teaching in other Italian cities, he finally arrived in Florence, where he became what I call the cultivator of the Renaissance. You see, his lectures and encouragement inspired several Florentine missions to retrieve rare texts from the Middle East before they were lost. Already, huge libraries had vanished, most notably in 1258, with the destruction of Baghdad and its universities such as Gandhi Shapur. Vast collections were dumped into the nearby rivers by the Mongol Christian army of Hulagu Khan. Many people don't know about Hulagu Khan and the destruction of Baghdad, a very important part in history. Thus, in 1423, Giovanni Arispa returned from the Middle East with 238 rare texts. More smaller collections were subsequently brought to Florence. Then, in 1469, Basiliosis, no, I didn't pronounce that right, Basiliosis, Bessarion, brought to Florence 800 volumes with alchemical, theological, esoteric, and philosophical content. And now let me introduce you to one of the most important characters to this Christmas story, George Gamistas Plathon. He was born in Constantinople in 1355. In 1428, Byzantine Emperor John VIII sought out the great wisdom of the pagan Plathon to ask him, how can the churches that were split in 1054 with the Great Schism be reunited? Because of his immense wisdom, although he was 83, Plathon was sent with the envoys to the 1438 Council of Florence. And while there, he was invited to lecture. Because of these lectures, he became what I call the catalyst for the Renaissance. For in the audience was Cosimo de' Medici, who became so excited, he founded the Accademia Platonica in Florence. Who was this Plathon? He was called a prince among philosophers. Marsilio Ficino called him the second Plato. Cardinal Bessarion, intrigued by the concept of reincarnation in his lectures, asked, is Plato's soul in this body? Even his name, Plathon, is derived from Plato, and many people pronounce his name Plathon. Plathon also delivered to the Florentines a trunk full of ancient books. Cosimo de' Medici hired Marsilio Ficino to have these translated into Latin. Today, we know little of these books, except that among them were some texts by Hermes Trismegistus on magic and alchemy. Did Leonardo ever attend this Platonic Academy in Florence? It seems likely that he did, even though no written proof has been found. Were its inner operations secret? We do know that Marsilio Ficino was head of the Academy from 1462 to 1492. And we know that Leonardo knew Ficino well, for many claim this portrait was done by Leonardo. Although Leonardo was only 10 years old when the Academy started, he was 30 when he left Florence, so he could have been a member for several years. We also know that when he arrived in Milan, Leonardo founded a very similar academy. Little is known about this Florence Academy or how it functioned. It does appear that it worked mostly in secret, perhaps to avoid the Inquisition. Was this just a club? Or did it ever offer initiations like those in Freemasonry or Rosicrucian lodges? And if so, was Leonardo ever initiated there? Along with all of those imported texts, these two lecturers, Chrysoloras and Plathon, certainly jump-started the Renaissance. The artists were inspired by the rebirth of Greek philosophy, especially Plato. Through these lectures and texts, Greek and mystery knowledge flowed again into Europe and found its way especially into Florentine art. Local artists became involved in exploring the relationship that stories from the New Testament had to Greek mythology. Here is one example in Botticelli's Birth of Venus, where the characters represent spirit, soul, and body, as listed by St. Paul in his first letter to Thessalonians. Because of the ruling of the Eighth Ecumenical Council in 869, that the human consists only of soma and a single psyche or soul, it could have been deemed a heresy in Leonardo's time to have written about these three aspects of the human being in a treatise. But it was, for the most part, safe to explore such concepts in art. To the Neoplatonist circle around Marsilio Ficino, the Eastern Magi were the wise men of the Prisca Theologia, a tradition that consisted of Hermes, Trismegistus, Orpheus, Pythagoras, Plato, and many others. So where did Plathon go in 1440 after his time in Florence? He died 13 years later at the ripe old age of 97, the same year and perhaps the same day that Leonardo was born. A historical note, Alexander was born on the same day that Herostratus threw a burning torch into the temple of Artemis and destroyed it. Plathon had embodied the last vestige of early Greek Christianity and the ancient mysteries into the Renaissance. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. When he left Florence, he returned to Greece to found a mystery center. Such evidence indicates that Plathon was indeed an initiate and a hierophant who likely trained another in Florence to carry on such duties after his departure. Plathon's new mystery center was near Sparta. This town became known as Mistra. Who could seriously do such a thing unless they were a legitimate hierophant? And Plathon was so loved and valued that when his students heard that he had died, they sailed in 1466 to Mistra, which was now in the hands of the Ottomans, to steal his remains and to reinter them in the nearby port of Rimini. This was a very dangerous mission that could have cost them their lives, but they were motivated. You see here his Italian tomb with the inscription, "So that the great teacher may be among free men." While what we just heard is insufficient proof, the case can be made that in his 30th year, Leonardo received an initiation from Plathon's unknown successor, who most likely was Ficino. What do I mean by initiation? In the ancient mystery centers, initiation was the practice that opened certain organs for spiritual perception. Some traditions call these chakras. But as intellectual ability grew for all individuals, so did egoism, with its potential to corrupt spiritual teachings. So, as the general intellectual abilities of humanity grew, the ancient mystery centers faded, coming to a close by the 5th century. Some forms of initiation persisted in the East, and possibly in groups such as the Bogomils and the Cathars, who had communities in southern France and in the Florentine region. The ancient initiation required the neophyte to be watched over and protected by a hierophant because they were put into a near death-like state for 3.5 days. After this conscious sojourn in the spiritual world, the hierophant called them back to their body. Each one who experienced such an initiation felt that they had been born again. With this background, we can now take up the mystery of painting that Leonardo called the Virgin of the Rock, or that we call today the Virgin of the Rocks. And let me just point out that after Golgotha and after these mysteries closed came a new Christian initiation, and then later in the 14th century, a Rosicrucian initiation that differed from this ancient one. Leonardo ceased work on his adoration because he knew from some convincing event that what he had been painting was untrue in some critical way. We know that Leonardo stopped his work on the adoration of the Magi to paint this Virgin of the Rocks without a commission. Why was this painting of such importance to Leonardo? Besides admiring Leonardo's artistic brilliance in this lecture, we will explore theological enigmas posed by this next painting. These enigmas have baffled art historians for centuries. I will now reveal what years of research by many, including myself, have uncovered concerning the mysteries embedded within these exquisite works of art. After seeing one version of the Virgin of the Rocks in London in 1978, luck allowed me to see the other in the Louvre of Paris 6 months later in the spring of 1979. It seemed quite odd to me that Leonardo had painted 2 copies of the Virgin of the Rocks. I instantly saw that the copy in Paris had some significant differences from the one I had seen in London just 6 months earlier. Now I was motivated to answer the question, why were there 2 such paintings with the same theme, and why were they different? Take a moment right now to compare these 2 paintings. Notice their similarities and their differences. Painters at this time did not paint to sell. They worked on commissions, and they typically had patrons who supported them as well. The reason for 2 was not, hey, this painting sells, let's get rich by making lots of copies in my studio. So again, why were there 2? Whoops, since 2005, there are now known to be 3 such paintings. Because this 3rd painting is in private hands in Switzerland, not much is known about it. We will need to largely ignore it for this lecture, but do notice that it seems to be a compromise between the 2. Because the early histories of these 2 paintings have remained largely unknown, debate once raged about which of these 2 Virgin of the Rocks was the original and which was the copy. Most art historians today agree that the Virgin at the Louvre is the original. Some still argue that the original is the one at the National Gallery. But various tests, like pollen tests, seem to confirm that the original is the one at the Louvre. Both paintings are oil paints on a wood panel that is nearly 2 meters tall. Evidence indicates Leonardo began this masterpiece while still in Florence in 1481, just after abandoning his Adoration of the Magi. As a side comment, I don't know how they did it, but the Louvre somehow transferred its paintings from the wood panel to canvas. Naturally, we ask, who is depicted? Art historians say both paintings show the Madonna or Mary, Christ child, and John the Baptist, and an angel. When we look at Leonardo's earliest painting that he did with his teacher Verrocchio, we would have to conclude that this in Virgin of the Rocks is not an angel, but an archangel, as it looks very similar to the archangel Gabriel in the other painting. But which archangel? Judeo-Christian lore had names for some of the archangels. The National Gallery claimed she is Uriel, the archangel of summer, for the season when John the Baptist was born. But we have a problem. Why is the archangel with the Christ child and not with John the Baptist? And why is Mary not with her infant? This problem leaves unresolved all 4 of these characters. If it is not John the Baptist, then who else could it be? We might even ask, is the central figure actually Mary? For she is not with her child, but with John the Baptist. And if not Mary, then who? As mentioned, it was 1978 when I toured the National Gallery and came to this painting. It was displayed so that one could look at it from behind to see Leonardo's signature. Thus, I could look at the painting from the side. Every oil painting was covered by a varnish, giving it a smooth surface. Upon a wood panel, the artist would first apply a foundation, then paint, and then, when complete, apply a varnish over the entire surface. Here is how the painting should have looked from the side, but I noticed this odd feature. The staff of John the Baptist was above the varnish, and so were the three halos. This puzzled me and began a 35-year search for answers. The National Gallery did not offer any answers. Eventually, my findings would run much deeper than I had ever anticipated. This is how the painting appeared when I saw it in 1978. To get me off my duff, 30 years later, in 2009, I read with horror that the National Gallery was planning to refurbish this painting. Such restorations removed all the yellow varnish, touched up the paint where needed, and applied a new coat of varnish. What would happen to the paint that had been above the varnish? Here you can see the differences from the removal of the old and yellow varnish. Notice the change in the color blue throughout the painting. One might say that the restoration revealed these characters as if they were being illuminated by moonlight. According to research papers from the National Gallery, they removed the old varnish up to the edge of these above the old varnish features. I was relieved. The keys to unlocking the mystery had not been destroyed. The mystery, why was there paint above the varnish, remained to be solved. As we try to answer this, we'll confront many more questions about the Virgin of the Rocks. We will seek answers from the painting's history. We'll find that through the Academia Platonica, Leonardo learned about not only Platonism and Neoplatonism, but also about the great theological debates of early Christianity. And we heard that he likely received an initiation as a member of this Platonic Academy. Realizing his depiction was in part untruth, he abandoned his adoration of the Magi to paint the truth that he depicted in his Virgin of the Rocks. But this depiction would have been considered a heresy in the 15th century if the Inquisition knew who was being depicted. We will explore what that heresy was, where it came from, and how Leonardo learned about it, and how he revealed it without the Inquisition realizing it. It was a plan of remarkable genius, but fitting for one of Leonardo's capabilities. Let's examine the paintings again to see what else stands out that might help us resolve this mystery. Recall the differences you found in these two paintings. These differences may be clues to help us understand what Leonardo was intending to depict and what his client, the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception, wanted when they commissioned him in 1482 for their new chapel in Milan. We have already mentioned John's staff and halos being above the varnish. Now examine the rocks here and compare these rocks to the rocks in the original painting. I'll go back, see the rocks here, and now the rocks here. These flat layered rocks are geologically correct. Stretching out from the rocks is a pool of water, a reflecting pool. And note that in this Virgin of the Rocks, the staff and halos were never painted. We should ask again, why not? Where in each painting is the archangel's gaze directed? The original, on our right, is accurate from an esoteric perspective. Such higher beings do not see the physical world, but only its reflection in the souls of humans. Thus, the archangel gazes into the reflecting pool to know what is happening. Notice how the painter has used the sleeve like stage curtains to draw our attention to these hand gestures. In the original, 3 hands are on the stage, but in the copy, only 2. In the copy, we can see the archangel's right arm is not pointing, but rather is resting on her knee. Compare the seated infant in both paintings. Note the archangel's left hand supports the child's back, suggesting that this child needs support to be on the earth. The child's left hand is placed on the rock. This is the only hand of all 8 hands in the picture that touches the earth element. Is this significant? Leonardo would have been well aware of the mythology of Prometheus, who had been chained to the rock element, as well as that these Greek gods represent something in our own soul life. Here we see the staff that was added after the painting was varnished. Note that its bottom is hidden behind a flower. This is acceptable, although quite awkward for a master. Likely it was not intended to be there when the painting was sketched out. What is the purpose of the woman's hand on this child? It is not there for support. Is it simply resting on his back near his shoulder, cuddling him? No. This hand is nearly identical in both paintings. Also, note the sheer cloth wrapped around this boy in both paintings. Although sheer, he is not quite naked like the other child we just studied. This suggests some earthly dignity for this infant. Recall the scene in Eden after Eve and Adam obtained knowledge. They became ashamed of their nakedness. Note also the flora. Some of the flowers on the top have 6 petals and some 5. This is botanically incorrect. Leonardo thus did not paint the entirety of this painting on the top, or this mistake would never have occurred. The flora on the bottom is botanically correct because Leonardo was an exact scientist. Now we are looking at both boys from the original Virgin of the Rocks. We see that only the child on the right is given support. This supposed Christ child is naked and unashamed of it. You see, Luke traced his ancestry back to Adam before the fall. Look again at their hands. Try to remember each infant's hand gesture as we continue. Now let's quickly review the differences we found. The archangel and her pointing hand, her colors and her gaze, the plant life and the foreground rocks. Lastly, the staff of John the Baptist and the halos that were added on top of the varnish. And likely you see some more differences, some more clues. We have found several differences that will help us to understand the changed meaning of the copy. Geometry was very important to Renaissance painters, especially Leonardo. If we draw a vertical line in the center of the painting, we can see that the central figure straddles this center line. With her hands, she draws something from the child on our left to bestow it to the other. Now I want to draw your attention to the circled areas. These 2 windows in the rocks are meant to relate to their respective infant below. The idea of reincarnation, while absent in Roman Catholicism, was certainly discussed in the Platonic Academy whenever Plato's transmigration of souls was a topic. Interestingly, there are 2 different lineages found, one in Matthew and one in Luke. We find one is kingly and one is priestly. I will now offer an insight I got from the work of Rudolf Steiner, who was a leading voice on esoteric Christianity during the early 1900s. The kingly Jesus of Matthew had many previous lives, including one as the original Zarathustra or Zoroaster, according to Steiner. This is indicated by the many rock pillars through which the river of life, perhaps we could call this river the Styx, flows by. The rock window above the priestly Jesus found in Luke has but one pillar of rock, and it is higher than any of those in the other oval. This represents the incarnation as Adam before the fall. At that time, he was the archetype of mankind. In the Kabbalah, this archetype that is held back in Eden at the time of the fall is known as Adam Kadmon, thus only one higher pillar. Thus, if Steiner is correct, what is depicted within the white ovals indicates each child's past lives. Of the four Gospels, two begin with a baptism, which could be called the time of the birth of Christ, while the other two give birth stories of Jesus. These birth stories are in Matthew and Luke. Two dates have been debated for the birth in Matthew's story. The great historian Josephus places Herod's death just after a lunar eclipse. Because such an eclipse occurred in 4 BC, that has been the consensus for many years until astronomer John Pratt showed that there was another eclipse visible in the region in December of 1 BC. I find it interesting that Herod died soon after the slaughter of the innocents, just as the Pope and the French King Philip IV died soon after they burned the Templar Knights in 1314. Luke's story is about shepherds, not kings. Herod is mentioned in chapter 1 of Luke when he offers a time frame saying, in the days of Herod. But chapter 1 is not about the birth of Jesus. It is about the birth of John the Baptist. Luke does not mention Herod again, nor a star, nor a fleeing to Egypt, and no killing of babies after Jesus is born. Looking at this evidence, one finds these are indeed different families, one from Bethlehem, where its Jesus is born in a house, and one from Nazareth that had to travel to Bethlehem to register for a census and to pay their tax. We've long assumed that there was one Jesus born as Jesus Christ. This chart outlines the differences between the birth stories of Matthew and Luke. Remember that both Mark and John start their gospel story with a baptism as the birth of Christ. Note that the family of Jesus in Matthew not only live in a house in Bethlehem, but its Jesus had at least 6 siblings, while the single child Luke family is poor and from Nazareth. A legal case could easily be made that these were indeed 2 different families. Earlier, we saw Giotto's Adoration. Both of these Giotto frescoes are near each other in the same cathedral. Here in the Matthew story, we see an active Joseph with a dark beard, while here in the Luke story, we see a removed, inactive, gray-bearded Joseph. They do not appear to be the same man, and certainly not of the same age. I've zoomed in here so you can see each Joseph up close. Time will not allow us to look at the so-called heresies, and there were many, of early Christianity. One such group was the Gnostic Christians. Typically, once a group was deemed to be heretical, an attempt was made to destroy all of their books. Some hidden texts survived, luckily, while history says a written copy of the Gnostic text, the Pistis Sophia, was found in Europe in 1773. It is nonetheless likely within one of the collections of books brought to Italy that the Pistis Sophia and perhaps other Gnostic texts were included, but the presence of such texts would likely have been kept secret. The Pistis Sophia refers to not only two messiahs, but also two families. The passage from chapters 59 through 62 is most significant. Two boys between 12 and 14 are described in this passage. One is working outdoors with his father when the other, in some spiritual form, comes to visit. From chapter 61, we read, "And he embraced thee, and he kissed thee, and thou also didst kiss him, and you became one." Leonardo and his students did extensive studies of kissing babies. Why? And who were these two infants? Over 30 such paintings are known to exist that have ties to Leonardo or his academy. Here we see one claimed to be a work by Leonardo, according to Stephen Holmes in his book, The Last Leonardo from 2007. Other historians suggest one of the Leonardo-eschi did this work. This one is by Jus van Cleve, who became known as the Leonardo of the North. Notice the Holy Spirit descending as a white dove, which is, of course, from the scene of the baptism. To whom does it descend? Jus and his students painted dozens of these kissing babies. Again, why would any artist of this time paint the scene over and over again? More importantly, who are the two boys being depicted? Might it be the kissing scene from Pistis Sophia? Probably not. These boys are certainly not 12 years old. Well, let's think again. Did Leonardo use innocent babies for the kissing scene so as not to stir up anti-homosexual sentiment that would have existed had he painted the kissing of 12 or 14-year-old boys? Was the scene to be non-sexual, pre-puberty? Was this meant to be a foreshadowing of the destiny of these two boys? Jus van Cleve completed many such paintings that seem to speak to each other. Notice how the bird on the rocks has moved, but otherwise these two separate paintings seem nearly identical. Leonardo set up his academy in Milan in 1483, and it lasted until about 1510. Jus was born in 1485 and would have been a late teen or a 20-something if he attended this academy. If not, he likely was exposed indirectly to Leonardo, as many a Flemish artist journeyed to study there with the master in Milan. By the way, these paintings were once known as kissing babes until the porn industry took that name. The Holy Infants Embracing theme was used in several Madonna studies done by Leonardo's students. Here we see the Thulan Madonna by Marco D'Aggiano, who was a student of Leonardo. Note her hand gestures. Her left hand is on the Book of Wisdom. There is no fear here of the slaughter of the innocents. This painting, called The Holy Family, is by an important young student of Leonardo, Bernardino Luini. The female's hand gestures are exactly the same as the Virgin of the Rocks, but now with the Holy Infants embracing between her hands. What are her hands doing? They are incongruous for this scene. By this, Luini is telling us that as a student, he knew of the themes and paintings we've been showing and has combined them into one painting. We can accurately make the comparison here of her hand gestures. Note also the tilt of her head. It is the same in both paintings. The Madonna's hands in Luini's painting serve no function except to point us to the central figure of Virgin of the Rocks. Why did Luini mix the scenes from Virgin of the Rocks and Holy Infants Embracing. Now we come to Bernardino de Conti. He was also good friends with Ambrogio de Preti, who was Leonardo's partner in painting the copy of Virgin of the Rocks. He is also the one who varnished that painting. And he was a member of Leonardo's workshop and academy. Compare how similar this is to the Thulan Madonna. They are remarkably similar, except for the backgrounds and some other details. It was shocking to me that this background is the same as the Virgin of the Rocks. Note the somewhat geologically correct flat rocks by the boy's feet. This is not just another Holy Infants Embracing. Obviously, he too was aware of both paintings. What is symbolically meant by the book? To whom do you think its wisdom is being granted? What do the halos tell us? Which boy do you think will be crucified? Yes, the one with the 3 crosses for a halo. Why 3 crosses on his head? Because there were 3 crucified on Golgotha, and Golgotha means the place of skulls. Compare de Conti's painting to the original Virgin of the Rocks. Not only are Madonna's hands reversed, but so are the children. This can only mean that the 2 children of Virgin of the Rocks are the same 2 children of Holy Infants Embracing, but on different sides. And de Conti is telling us that the central figure is bestowing wisdom to the child on the left from the Book of Wisdom. Thus, in the original Virgin of the Rocks, the boy on our left has within him the Book of Wisdom. She will draw forth this inner wisdom to bestow it on the other boy. By using the same background, de Conti was definitely trying to inform us that his painting reveals something important about the original Virgin of the Rocks. Here again is a painting by Bernardino de Conti, and this time he has depicted John the Baptist. Obviously, de Conti knows to use the staff when depicting the Baptist. Was this painting done to give himself protection from the heresy hunters? He leaves us clues. First, note the halos. Again. Now remember the 2 windows in Virgin of the Rocks. Okay, look at these 2 windows. They show 2 very different scenes. This is physically impossible for these 2 windows to show such different scenes. So why do you think de Conti purposefully did that? With this painting, Bernardino de Conti played a key role in the revelation of the mystery of the Virgin of the Rocks. Here we have the familiar 2 children from Virgin of the Rocks. Who do you expect to be in their midst? The Madonna, right? This painting is called The 3 Children. With John the Baptist in the middle, then who are the other 2? We have the exact Virgin of the Rocks poses. This time the boys are not reversed. The one on our left has royal robes behind him. Look right behind his back. Note the halo of the Jesus in the hands of both boys, very similar to those of Madonna in John the Baptist here. Why is John here between them, where the Madonna would be? Is he saying that a transfer will happen when the 2 will be made one before the baptism? For the 2 must become one, the one who will represent all of humanity for the Christ to enter at the baptism. And by the way, this is housed in a private Swiss collection and was used in 2005 in an exhibit in Ancona, Italy by Carlo Pedretti. We see these paintings speaking to each other. Note in the central figures, both have the now familiar head tilt. Their hands, although different, have similar gestures. Since it is not John the Baptist, then who is the boy on the left, the one with the royal robes? The one who has 3 crosses for a halo, that must be Jesus. But who is the other boy? Even Raphael must have been in on this secret. Here is his Madonna Terra Nuova, painted when he was 22. But how could he have been in on this secret since Leonardo had left Florence even before Raphael was born? Well, Leonardo was back in Florence from 1501 to 1506, and this painting was completed in 1505. We see on the left John the Baptist, the naked baby Jesus in the lap of the Madonna, and again a third boy with a halo and royal robes on the right. And the Madonna has the same head tilt and left hand gesture. We have already seen a connection to the Gnostic text Pistis Sophia. Now we'll find more theological sources for what the Virgin of the Rocks depicts. We'll start with the ancient text known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. The first of the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in caves near a former Essene community called Qumran. Found so far have been 872 scrolls that were written in Hebrew and Aramaic by Essene initiates from approximately 150 BC until 70 AD. In 70 AD was when the Roman army dispersed all Jews from Palestine, including the Essenes. These Dead Sea Scrolls reveal that 2 messiahs were expected. Historian Millar Burrows states, quote, "Most scholars now agree that 2 anointed ones are meant by what's in these texts." And he writes, quote, "The Qumranites expected the coming of not 1, but 2 messiahs," end quote. 1 of a priestly lineage and 1 kingly. Livius, spelled livius.org, which is a Jewish theological website, writes, quote, "Its members," that is the Essenes of Qumran, "were looking forward to a Messiah of Israel and a Messiah of David, who represent the priestly and kingly descendants." One of these scrolls, the Damascus document, states, quote, "The Messiah, which is the son of Joseph, will be made one with the son of David, but he will be killed." Historian Michael V. Flowers writes about another Dead Sea Scroll, Melchizedek, saying it too describes 2 messiahs. The first is a Davidic royal Messiah, and the second is priestly like Aaron. You might wonder, did Leonardo know about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Of course not. But these scrolls do contain many texts that were known by Leonardo's contemporary scholars, such as the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. This was translated in the 13th century by Robert Grosseteste, meaning that it was available for Leonardo to read. In one of these testaments, the Testament of Simeon, we read, quote, "For the Lord will rise up from Levi," and just as an aside, in the tribe of Israel, the Levites were the bloodline for the priests. So the Lord will rise up from Levi someone as a high priest, and from Judah someone as king. And this one will save all the Gentiles and the tribe of Israel. Expectations of 2 anointed ones are found in other holy texts. For example, the book of Zohar and the Kabbalah has these words, Another Messiah, the son of Joseph, will unite himself with the Messiah, the son of David. But the son of Joseph will not remain in life. He will be killed and will become alive again when the little hill receives life upon the great hill. The little hill receives life upon the great hill. This has baffled historians. De Conti gave us his interpretation of this in his Three Children. For Golgotha is a hill known as the place of skulls, and a skull is a hill on one's shoulders. Here again, we see the three crosses of Golgotha that foretell this child's destiny. The little hill on the great hill. Most don't realize it, but in the Old Testament, there are three books that also prophesize about two messiahs. These are Zechariah, Numbers, and Ezekiel. The passages respectively are, these are the two anointed ones that stand by the Lord of the whole earth. And there shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. And they, the sticks of Judah and Joseph, shall become one in thine hand. In summary, the prophets expected two births or messiahs, then a merging of the two, and then a baptism where the Christ Spirit would settle into the united body. It is also important to realize that Christmas was not celebrated until 354 AD, after Christianity had become the religion of the Roman Empire. Much of Christianity adopted to local customs. This helped it spread. Many have written about the historical inaccuracies of the birth of Jesus. As we heard, historians have placed King Herod's death between 4 and 1 BC. In the Matthew story, the slaughter of the innocents was carried out by Herod. Thus, its Jesus was born before Herod died. In Luke's story, there is no slaughter of innocents. Thus, Luke's story must have taken place after Herod's death. Since the event on Golgotha occurred when Jesus was 33, then the Jesus of Luke's gospel must have been born in year 1. Could there have been two messiahs? It does seem unlikely that there would be two different families who had the same names for their sons. Yet, because, again, the name Jesus was a popular name, it certainly was possible. But there is no denying that Matthew and Luke tell very different stories of the birth of Jesus. Look at all of these differences. For example, to whom does the angel speak? Where are the families from? Did they have brothers and sisters? The Gospels of Mark and John both begin their story of Christ with the baptism. What little of early Christianity's different, and perhaps there were 12 theologies, we know only from what can be gleaned from its opponent, the proto-Orthodox Christians, that sought to destroy these others as heresies. With our concepts today deeply rooted in materialism, the spiritual focus of these ousted theologies has become difficult for us to grasp. Their focus was on the mystery that happened upon Golgotha and on the event of Easter. Their nativities were not important to their religion. The nativities were not important to their religion. They knew that the origin of Christianity was in the mystery wisdom that flowed into Hellenistic philosophies and on into early Christianity. St. Augustine expressed this when he wrote, "They were Christian before the term came into being." Christmas was not important until after 354 AD in Rome and after 380 AD in Constantinople. Fathers of the church, Origen and Clement of Alexandria, both objected to the celebration of any birthday as being a pagan custom. Early Christianity's theology is dismissed today as childish concepts, perhaps with a bit of arrogance. Early Christians were far from uniform in their beliefs. For many of the early Christians, Christ entered Jesus at the baptism when he was 30 years old. The ancient mysteries had offered wisdom of the coming of the sun god, that is, the cosmic Christ. They placed the birth of Christ at the baptism when the cosmic Christ united with Jesus of Nazareth. After 3 years, the Christ would fully penetrate this body, even into the bones. And thus, when he experienced death, he fully became mankind. In Greek mythology, Helios was known as the sun god. He was beardless and drove his chariot across the heavens each day. In Persian lore, he was also known as Ahura Mazda, and in Egyptian as Ra. Here we see the sun god depicted in pottery from ancient Greece. Was this sun god meant in the words, "I am the light of the world"? This image was found in the Christian tomb of Julai in the Vatican necropolis located in Rome. It is an example of early Christian art showing Christ as the unconquered sun god. It is interesting that the concept of Christ holding the whole earth in his hand was also painted by Leonardo in his Salvator Mundi. Much of the early Christian world were followers of Arius, especially the Goths. For Arian Christians, the birth of Christ was at the baptism. Here you see their ceiling mosaic found in Ravenna, Italy. Is there biblical support for Christ's birth happening at the baptism? Yes, indeed. Psalms 2:7 predicts God will say, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." And so these words appeared in Hebrews 1:5. Professor Bart Ehrman and other scholars have found that the pre-3rd century gospel texts also had similar words for the baptism. Luke chapter 3:22, for example, had God's voice at the baptism saying, quote, "Today I have begotten you." But this was changed in later versions to, "Thou art my beloved son, in thee I am well pleased." We find similar statements in Romans by Paul, which reads, "As to his human nature," speaking of Jesus, Jesus was a descendant of David. And in his letter to Galatians, Jesus was born of a woman, born under the law. So we see they felt Jesus was not Christ at birth. In the Shepherd of Hermas, a popular 2nd century text, we find, quote, "Jesus was a virtuous man who became filled with the Holy Spirit of the Son, end quote. Lastly, Theodotus of Byzantine, a late 2nd century writer, wrote, "Jesus was a man born of a virgin who lived like other pious men. At his baptism in the Jordan, the Christ came down upon this man, Jesus, in the likeness of a dove." At this point, we've proposed that the intended depiction of Leonardo's Virgin of the Rocks was based upon pre-Christian and early Christian theologies that expected 2 messiahs. If this theory of 2 Jesus children is to be seriously considered, then why is there just one Jesus later in life? We have heard that the Pistis Sophia spoke of a merger of the two boys. We also saw some pre-Christian writings saying, they shall become one in thine hand. Where does Leonardo address this? Here is one example by his student Bernardino Luini with his Jesus Among the Doctors. His image strongly presents the theme of the two becoming one with the hand gesture over the heart of Jesus. There are other supportive paintings by Leonardo's students that I mention in my book, The Hidden Heretic of the Renaissance. Leonardo does not directly show us, rather, he used his students to indirectly reveal his knowledge of this. It was Leonardo's students who paint the scene where these two Jesus children were united. They used the story from Luke when its Jesus was 12 years old. The story goes, the family is with many others from Nazareth. Jesus was left behind after the Passover celebrations in Jerusalem. For 3 days he was missing. His parents finally find him in the temple conversing with its doctors. Let's listen to their conversation. Quote, his mother said to him, son, why hast thou dealt with us in this way? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee for over 3 days with much sorrowing. And he said unto them, how is it that ye sought me? Did you not know that it was necessary for me to be here now in my father's house? Again, I need to express my appreciation to Rudolf Steiner, who described that this merger occurred within the Holy of the Holies of the temple in Jerusalem, and thus it took over 3 days for his parents to find him. As a transformed Jesus, his parents were amazed at his newfound knowledge and wisdom. Luke continues with the words, and he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject unto them. But his mother kept all these sayings in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. There is insufficient time to delve deeply into this mysterious merger. Suffice it to say that according to Steiner, the pure physical body of the Luke Jesus received the earthly and cosmic wisdom within the highly developed spiritual components of the Matthew Jesus. Within a few months, this Matthew Jesus, now without its ego, or that is its I am, would fade and soon die. With the spiritual components of the Matthew Jesus now incorporated, this Luke Jesus would quickly change in character. One could say this merger would be like a practice run for what would occur at the baptism. If such knowledge existed in various early Christian communities, would there not be some evidence? Early in the 1st century, so-called heretics were excommunicated or sent into exile. After the 3rd century, heretics were put to death and their beliefs purged with all their books burned. Here we see one surviving example, done in the relative safety of a painting. These two boys, apparently 12 or 14 or so, each have a halo. The 6th century painting seems to say, through their halos, or the spiritual, that they will merge through the guidance of the Christ, so that the Christ could come to their merged being. So what evidence do we have that Leonardo knew of this? His students. They took up this cause, for it would have been far too dangerous for Leonardo alone to spell out this story in his art. This Jesus among the doctors is by Bernardino de Beto, also known as Pinturicchio, who lived 1452 to 1513. He finished this painting in 1501. On the right, we see Mary and Joseph entering the scene. The books of the learned doctors have been thrown on the ground, symbolic that their knowledge fades in the face of this 12-year-old boy. Note his halo with the red cross inscribed. Let's look closer. First, notice the hand gesture. It says, the two will become one. Next, we notice the feet. On our right, the child with the halo is standing on the earth, barefoot. But on the left, both children's feet are lifted off the earth, one by socks and one by shoes. Of these two children, one is well-dressed, the other poorly dressed. Notice the colors of the well-dressed boy, his green and magenta top with gold undershirt. Remember those colors. He has a blue-bound book in hand, while the other has a white sack with something inside that might be a book. They are departing. They represent the two Jesus children as they once were, but will no longer be. We see that these two boys are framed by 5 individuals. Note their clothing colors from left to right: black, blue, gold, green and magenta, and in the 5th, a royal purple. Each of the 4 carry an object in their hand. The 4 facing the two children represent the physical black, soma blue, psyche gold, and pneuma rose green. This 5th is the Hierophant who performed the spiritual merging of these two within the Holy of the Holies. The result was the boy with the halo. Here we see all the characters in the full painting again. A most remarkable painting when seen in this light. This Jesus among the doctors is from Ambrogio Bergognoni. We see the curtain that will be rent in two at the close of the crucifixion. It is covering the Holy of the Holies. Entering from our left is Mary and Joseph weeping. The Matthew child that they will take is fading. The other boy watches as he addresses the doctors. We still have not settled on the history of the paintings, Virgin of the Rocks, nor answered why there were 2 or 3. Why was this second painting made? Leonardo had been commissioned by a confraternity of the Immaculate Conception in 1482 or 3. They rejected the original painting, probably on theological grounds. Leonardo did not want to part with his original, so he offered to make them a copy. They knew Leonardo was perhaps the best artist of the times. Leonardo won the commission soon after he had arrived in Milan, likely by showing them the unfinished original Virgin of the Rocks. They accepted Leonardo's proposal, which was to make a new, similar copy with Ambrogio de Preti that would be acceptable to them theologically. They agreed on 800 lire for this second painting. They would pay in installments. It was supposed to be done by December 1483. In February of 1485, payments for the painting had reached the agreed 800 lire, but the work was not finished. In 1490, Leonardo and his partner, Ambrogio de Preti, worked with the brethren and wrote to them asking for 1,200 more lire, saying that the entire 800 lire had been spent on the frame and its gold leafing. The confraternity, seemingly in a position of power, offered only 100 lire more. I suspect that they had in their possession Leonardo's original Virgin of the Rocks as a placeholder. Leonardo and Ambrogio then requested the Duke of Milan to intervene. Solving the dispute with the painters proved to be very difficult for the confraternity. It would not be until March 9th, 1503, when Louis XII of France, who had successfully invaded Lombardy in 1499, that he was asked to intervene, and he did. Remember, Leonardo at this time was not in Milan, but in Florence again. Documents show that on June 23rd, 1503, the confraternity contested Leonardo's request for, quote, expert evaluation or the return of the painting. Again, I assume the painting to be returned would have been the original Virgin of the Rocks. Finally, on the 27th of April, 1506, a judge ruled that the work for the confraternity was still incomplete and that Leonardo was legally obliged to return to Milan to complete it. But recall, that painting had already been varnished. By 1507, Leonardo had traveled to Milan from Florence and performed some touch-ups to the proposed painting. These touch-ups made the painting acceptable. This in itself is an amazing story, for Leonardo convinced the confraternity that their desired staff and halos would now stand out in candlelight. He designed a special gold paint for these touch-ups. Then on August 18, 1508, the painting was installed. Let's quickly review where Leonardo was located during these years, because it can be confusing. In 1482, he left Florence for the safety of Milan. In 1485, his academy in Milan was already active. In 1492, the geometrician Luca Pacioli was invited to teach there. In 1494, the First Italian War with France began. Savonarola then controlled Florence until 1498. In 1499, Leonardo fled Milan at the start of the Second Italian War. He made several stops on his way to Florence, where he arrived in 1501. There he influenced Raphael while he began his masterpiece, the Mona Lisa, in 1505. He returned to Milan from Florence to finish that painting late in 1506 or early 1507. He continued his academy work and began to paint Leda and the Swan, which is a painting I wish I could go into for this. In 1515, he moved to Rome, but he was very unhappy there, and thus he accepted an invitation by the King of France in 1516 to move to Clos-Lucé. There he died on the 2nd of May, 1519, at the age of 67. Leonardo abandoned his adoration of the Magi to paint a more full truth that he had experienced through what he had learned at the Platonic Academy, or perhaps by an initiation in 1481. He immediately began to paint instead the Virgin of the Rocks. In case you were wondering, what did Leonardo's client do when he abandoned his adoration? Well, they hired Filippo Lippi's son, Filippino, to paint an adoration that you see here. We found that Leonardo was able to show how Christ came for all of humanity. Embedded in the stories of Matthew and Luke were two streams of humanity that reached their resolution in their merging. We might even say these were the streams of Cain and Abel. The rest of this story was told by Leonardo's students. Perhaps the most revealing of the many works by Leonardo's students was this by Bernardino da Conti, and also this painting by Pinturicchio that showed how the two became one, thereby enabling the birth of Christ at the baptism into one body that represented all of humanity. And to close, we see here Leonardo's own painting of John the Baptist. For this, he chose the imp Salai, who both church and public officials thought to be an unredeemable delinquent. Leonardo had saved Salai and tried to teach him painting. He used him as a model for some paintings. Leonardo is showing us here that he does know about the symbol of John's staff. Notice the smirk. Was Leonardo mocking the church? In my mind, Leonardo clearly understood how Christianity had fulfilled the ancient mysteries with what took place at the baptism. Oh my, I left one character unidentified. Well, now you know who she is. Thank you for being such a great audience and for inwardly and fully participating in this lengthy webinar. For those who want to go deeper into the question, why Leonardo abandoned his adoration, I'm showing now my book on this subject. It can be ordered along with The Hidden Heretic of the Renaissance through Amazon at the link shown below. Now I'll be happy to take some questions. Oh, and I want to wish you all a wonderful holiday season ahead, and I hope you ponder during the Holy Nights Leonardo's Christmas tale. Good night to you,